Hi there, Godfather of Anxiety. Just wanted to do a short video about, you'll often hear me talk about anxiety spectrum conditions. And this video is going to be about exactly what that spectrum of conditions are. And it varies depending on what clinic, what website you look at, but there are some commonalities. And then also, I just wanted to give you guys a firsthand perspective too of the fact that you can experience more than one of these anxiety spectrum conditions simultaneously. So, and I think that's something that, again, I don't hear it talked about as much, but I'm going to let you know firsthand how exactly these anxiety spectrum conditions started with me and what different ones I experienced, especially initially at the onset. So, as far as the anxiety spectrum conditions, you're going to have generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD. And this is basically, persistent or excessive worry constantly. And it can involve your health. Health anxiety would kind of fall into generalized anxiety disorder. It can just be that uneasy feeling about everything. And I definitely had this at the onset. In fact, every morning I would wake up, and for about 30 seconds when I first woke up, the first thing I would do is I'd search for that feeling that it's like a knot in your stomach. Those of you out there who've experienced generalized anxiety disorder probably know what I'm talking about. But for about 30 seconds when I first woke up, I wouldn't feel it. And then it'd start to happen. I'd start to get that tight feeling in the middle of my chest, my stomach. I would start to feel nauseous. And I would start to slightly detach from my environment. Not full-blown derealization or depersonalization, but just things weren't quite right. So I definitely experienced this right at the beginning. In fact, you could argue that was maybe some of my initial symptoms would fall more into generalized anxiety disorder. I didn't know exactly what I was dealing with. I knew I wasn't getting enough sleep, and I knew I was stressed, but I didn't know that there was a name for what I was experiencing. And it didn't really manifest itself fully until after I had my first panic attack. And that's the next anxiety spectrum condition that I'm going to talk about. That's panic disorder. And this was my initial diagnosis when I did finally see a mental health professional a few years later, because of the prevalence of panic attacks that I had had. I had had so many panic attacks at that point, probably hundreds. In the first 3 years, I would say probably hundreds of panic attacks. And so a panic attack and panic disorder is basically having panic attacks. And panic attacks, I've told you guys about the symptoms. They're very acute. They're very acute fight or flight symptoms. So you're going to feel that. I love how they call it impending doom, right? So I'll translate that to English for you guys. You feel like you're dying. Not like you might die or you could die, like you're dying right then. And then to make this feeling more real, you also will get this detached feeling, or the derealization, except much more intensely than you would feel it with generalized anxiety disorder. You feel like you're fading away. So, and I've discussed in other videos very specifically all the symptoms I experienced while I was having panic attacks. But you can have chest pains, you can feel really cold, really hot, you can feel like you're going to pass out, you can feel like you're choking, like you can't catch your breath. Oh, that was all the time with my panic attacks. So that that's what a panic attack is. And if you are having those on a regular basis, they will often diagnose you with panic disorder, and they will try to treat you appropriately or accordingly. A lot of the time, they might prescribe a benzodiazepine to try to, attack the actual panic attack, to treat the actual panic attack, to make it so that it doesn't happen. So when I'll get more into specifically how this happened when I was first experiencing anxiety spectrum conditions, but I definitely had generalized anxiety and panic disorder at the same time. Then you'll also hear specific phobias that you might have. I didn't necessarily have specific phobias, but another thing listed in the anxiety spectrum is agoraphobia. And agoraphobia can be fear of using public transportation, being in open spaces. I told you guys in another video, it actually comes from the term marketplace. So it actually be like fear of a marketplace. And ironically enough, a lot of people who have panic disorder, some of the first places they'll experience panic attacks is in a grocery store. Not a war zone, a battlefield, but a grocery store. So I don't know exactly why that is. But obviously also being in enclosed spaces, standing in line or in a big crowd, or being outside of the home. And this is another thing I noticed right away, that I wasn't very comfortable. The further I got away from my house, the more uncomfortable I would be. So again, when I first had these conditions, agoraphobia was probably about 6 months in, but I'll get a little more detailed after I'm done going through the anxiety spectrum conditions. Now, they mention on this particular website, they're mentioning social anxiety disorder. I have since come to understand social anxiety disorder a little differently, realizing that there very frequently is a cause of social anxiety disorder of maybe past mistreatment or abuse. And this can come from your parents, it can come from a bully in school, but a lot of the time that will be what triggers that. I will say that from a symptom standpoint, I definitely developed social anxiety. One of the things mentioned as a potential symptom when you have social anxiety disorder is fear of public speaking. And that is definitely something that I have, and that intensified greatly upon the onset of my anxiety diagnosis. And here's some other ones. PTSD, again, that's going to be something that follows trauma. Very frequently when we think of PTSD, we think of soldiers coming back from war, right? So, but you can get that from something, not quite as dramatic as fighting in a war. There's all kinds of abuse or traumatic events that can cause or trigger PTSD. So, there's that one. There's also obsessive compulsive disorder. And this was definitely part of my initial onset of symptoms. And it was one of the worst because I specifically had intrusive thought obsessive compulsive disorder, which is unbelievably horrible. And so that in a nutshell, that covers some of the anxiety, most of the anxiety spectrum conditions. They also mention acute stress disorder and adjustment disorder. Probably if you look at a variety of different websites or psychiatric clinics, You're going to get slightly different definitions on each one. I will tell you guys this, they overlap. The symptoms overlap. So why I made the video, though, is because I think that when these things are happening to you, first thing I wanted to do, and I'm sure if you're going through this, it's the same thing. You want to find out what's going on. So at first, I wasn't even thinking when I was having these panic attacks that it was stress. Now I look back on that, and that seems kind of, it was kind of strange that I didn't put it together. But again, the symptoms were so physiological that I couldn't process that acute stress would cause, that level of symptoms. I was a worrier my whole life. But I never had a panic attack until I was 31 years old. So I often tell you guys that this started with a panic attack in the car. I was driving home from Montreal Montreal, Canada, and I had a ridiculously long, intense panic attack. When I got back home, I didn't feel right for several weeks. I had the generalized anxiety. Within a month, I started to have very strong intrusive thought, obsessive compulsive disorder. And, the symptoms of that are horrible, horrible. Whatever thought will disgust you or scare you the most, just picture that playing on a loop in your mind all the time. It's not a conscious thought. It's not something you're controlling. It's just playing automatically on a loop. And that was one of the worst symptoms that I had, or one of the worst things that was going on there. So I was having generalized anxiety disorder symptoms. I was having panic disorder symptoms. I was having intrusive thought, obsessive compulsive disorder symptoms. I very quickly became agoraphobic. It does not take long if you're having multiple panic attacks every day to become agoraphobic. You're looking for that safe place or that safe person, and the further you get from them or from home, the more your anxiety will go up. So I experienced all of those things simultaneously. And for the first year and a half, 2 years, they just got worse and worse and worse. Especially the panic attacks and the intrusive thought OCD. Now, why I made the video, though, is because I think a lot of people, you see these conditions listed and you're like, well, which one do I have? They overlap. You could have one of them, and especially at the onset, and this is something you'll see if you do research on it, when you first start having, whether it's panic attacks or generalized anxiety or intrusive thought OCD or OCD, you might experience all of these simultaneously, or most of them, of the anxiety spectrum conditions. It's not uncommon at all. And it was in that first couple of years where I really experienced, in a fairly intense way, all of the ones that I just mentioned to you. And so it was that's really overwhelming to deal with. You're not just dealing with one thing, you're dealing with multiple things. So it does make it very difficult to address. But usually what'll happen, first of all, guys, if you're having any of these, get the help from a mental health professional. Go do it. Don't wait. The sooner you get help, the sooner you'll get better. So I'll just preface, my comments with that statement because it's really important. But you will notice as time goes on, generally, that you probably fall kind of more into one of those specific categories. That's not always the case. But, when I was initially diagnosed, I was diagnosed with panic disorder. But I also was diagnosed as being clinically depressed. Now, that is another thing that I wanted to mention. Even though clinical depression is not part of anxiety spectrum disorders, when you look at it, when you're doing research, I find that very frequently, in my experience, the two conditions are experienced simultaneously. And in my case, it was definitely the anxiety that came first, but without any question, within a year, I was extremely, severely clinically depressed. And, some of the symptoms and you wouldn't think this, but some of the symptoms of anxiety and depression, and that's why they're so frequently mentioned together, they overlap. The symptoms of depression, they really make you feel extremely disconnected. And so do the symptoms of anxiety. The mechanisms might be slightly different, but they seem to feed each other and work together. And very frequently, you will experience anxiety spectrum conditions along with clinical depression. This is something that you need to talk to a mental health professional about to get diagnosed. But you wouldn't believe how many times you will see a doctor, a psychiatrist, and their diagnosis is anxiety and depression. So, again, if you guys are experiencing overlapping symptoms or multiple symptoms, don't let that make you think that you're doomed, or boy, I must have it worse than everyone else, because I'm telling you, very frequently you will experience symptoms of the entire spectrum, especially on the initial onset of symptoms. For me, I was blessed to have 31 years where I did not have any diagnosable condition. But, upon the onset of it, it was intense, and it covered that and the entire spectrum of anxiety spectrum conditions. And so don't overreact to this. One of the things I always tell you guys, other than getting treatment, is one of the keys to getting better is to let these things happen. For whatever reason, it seems like the purpose or the driving force in your mind is to find fear and worry in everything. And it spills over in all of these different conditions. And that's where the catastrophizing comes in. And it's like your mind is like intentionally trying to keep you in fight or flight. Now, without getting into too deep of a conversation, a lot of this comes from the fact that people with these anxiety spectrum conditions definitely tend to be control freaks. So we're trying to gain control, and we'll do it, our minds will do it in any way they possibly can. And obviously there's also some electrical impulses that are either being misinterpreted, or even potentially some brain chemistry, whether it's serotonin levels or, norepinephrine. There are definitely some things that are going wrong with the wiring and maybe the chemicals in your brain. So they tend to come on all at once. So my point in making the video is, don't overreact. Don't think that there's something wrong with you if you're experiencing symptoms from all of these anxiety spectrum conditions, because that happens constantly. And you may very well be able to be diagnosed with more than one of the anxiety spectrum conditions. It doesn't make it so that you're not going to be able to recover. It's not going to be able to make it so that, you're in this place where no one's ever been. Trust me, this is very common. And that was pretty much the reason why I wanted to make the video, so that you guys know that these things often occur together, and they often occur along with depression. And that makes it can make it potentially more difficult to treat. But, you can overcome it and get through it. So, like I told you guys before, with me, I took I was when I actually 6 years after the onset of my symptoms, when I was successfully treated, I was prescribed a slow-acting benzodiazepine and an SSRI. And the SSRI is mostly for depression. I also found it to be a phenomenal mood stabilizer. And the benzodiazepine was to treat the anxiety and specifically the panic. And those drugs worked very, very well in bringing me from a place where I felt like I was on the verge of a psychotic break because of how high my level of anxiety and derealization and depersonalization were, to actually being able to live my life. And, you know, again, there was a lot of therapy that went into it as well. A lot of exposure therapy, a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy. But that set me on the road to recovery. And again, it doesn't completely go away. Maybe I've had a couple of relapses, again, that I've referred to on the channel. But having the tools so that you know what it is and that you know how to react to it is super important. So the video went a little longer than I wanted, guys, but I just want you guys to know that, you know, don't feel like there's something wrong with you, or something's extra bad, or your wiring's extra bad if you're experiencing, you know, symptoms from more than one of these anxiety spectrum conditions. I also take this opportunity to thank you guys so much for the engagement. I really appreciate it. Like, share, subscribe. If you know anybody who's experiencing any of these anxiety spectrum conditions, have them check out the channel. And until my next video, take care.